Welcome back to the Pioneers Sideline. I am now joined by Zach Weiss from the Globe. Zach, you're currently writing an article with some interesting material. Can you give us a little bit of insight of what you've got here?
Absolutely, Chris. First of all, great to see you and glad to be part of Pioneers Sideline. Basically, what's going to happen is I'm writing a Globe article regarding the KIAC tournament, which in women's basketball, men's basketball, since both teams are hosts. And essentially, to make a long story short, Point Park lost its right to host due to a bylaw, according to KIAC Commissioner Bill Melton, who was reached for comment at the time of this story. The tournament was originally supposed to be hosted by Midway due to a KIAC bylaw, which stated that the tournament was to be hosted in alphabetical order.
Now, Zach, the Pioneers, it was hosted in IU Southeast last year, so Midway, in terms, would have had to have passed on hosting a tournament this year. So what did Melton give you that said the Pioneers were not able to host a tournament this year, something that really would help them out?
Absolutely, Chris. Basically, Commissioner Melton referred to the fact that Point Park was a new school and that this was their second year in existence, although the way he made it sound like they were a newer school than that, as though they came in the first season. So essentially, Point Park was passed over, and alphabetically next, Alice Lloyd was next on the list. So assuming Point Park wins its quarterfinal game next Tuesday, it will be a long trek to Pivot Passes, Kentucky.
And that's the big thing, Zach, because the Pioneers, they're a better team at home, as we've seen on the road. And it really affects them because that's an 8-hour drive down into Kentucky against Alice Lloyd, who's had some success against the Pioneers in only the 2 years we've had the Pioneers and Alice Lloyd in the same conference. But one of the big thing is, what was the team's reaction, Zach? What did Coach Grenick what did Coach Grenick say to you afterwards once he found out the Pioneers really were kind of passed over and have to wait basically at least another 5 to 6 seasons before they have the chance to really host this?
Absolutely, Chris. It's a very frustrating factor, to say the least, in that Point Park thought they had the right to host, and between Point Park men's and women's basketball teams, there's a collective group that contains 10 seniors. And from that point forward, essentially, you look at Point Park has to go a lot through the alphabet, and there's going to be some new additions to KIAC women's basketball and KIAC men's basketball coming up in the near future. I'm sure that news will come out. However, at this point, Point Park has to wait, and honestly, it's a frustration factor. I mean, these Kentucky trips are really tiring on the players, I would imagine, because a lot of these Kentucky schools are essentially an hour, 2 hours away, whereas Point Park has to travel the day before and get their legs under them to prepare for a matchup. And lately that hasn't gone so well. You saw this past weekend a loss against Asbury, where both teams, to be quite frank, at times looked really flat. So it's a huge time, and Point Park has 30 games this season on the women's side, which is the most that they've had in a season. Coach Grenick's really making them work for it, and when you have Alice Lloyd, who hasn't lost that many times at home, Point Park being their only loss on the women's side, it really speaks to the success that KIAC home teams have. Compiling the research, they've won 67% of their games at home this season. So if you don't think that KIAC hosting at home is important, then you're really fooling yourself, to be honest with you, Chris.
And we've seen it with the Pioneers, too. They've had great success under Coach Tony Grenick. Now, my one big question for you, Zach, is we've seen Cincinnati Christian, they've added a women's team into KIAC. We've seen IU Kokomo come in. So does that mean when it gets to Cincinnati Christian and IU Kokomo, their first times around, would they be able to host right off the bat then based off these new bylaws?
Well, according to Commissioner Melton, he stated that after the effect was made with Alice Lloyd, where Alice Lloyd had to host the conference, he made a rule which stated that Alice Lloyd and future new conference teams that join the conference immediately if it falls to them would host. He said that he was a big proponent of that. And unfortunately for Point Park, it's a little bit out of luck in that sense, but you have to look at the fact that I guess maybe it does benefit other conferences. But when I did ask the follow-up question to Commissioner Melton, what was the timetable between the decision that Alice Lloyd got to host versus now the new teams get to host, he said essentially he's not sure. He was the proponent of the rule, so maybe a little bit of confusion there, maybe just a little bit of a heat of the moment in the interview kind of nervousness. But essentially, to make a long story short, Point Park is really on the short end of the stick, and it would come down to, again, as according to Melton, the athletic directors would have to move back to Point Park, and considering how they passed over Point Park the last time, odds are Point Park would not be able to host next year, and it's going to be a long wait to host in men's and women's basketball.
And you mentioned earlier, Zach, the teams in the KIAC have had a lot more success at home and away. That's been seen under Coach Tony Grenick for the women. They have had so much more success at home than on the road. And the men's team, since they've joined this KIAC, they've been a completely different team on the road. They're a team that does very well at home, can compete with just about anyone. but they've struggled on the road. So this conference tournament being moved to Alice Lloyd instead of being at Point Park, where in theory it possibly could have been this year, really hurts them in the long run.
Absolutely. Looking from a men's basketball perspective, the men historically, at least in my time here at Point Park, the issue's been how do they respond from long breaks. And Point Park's really been dealt a bad hand this year on the men's side, where a lot of players unfortunately have been unable to suit up for a variety of reasons. However, it really leaves Point Park shorthanded, and to make that trip with such few bodies, it makes it a really, really tall task, because not only do you have to travel to Kentucky, the women are 15 players deep. The men do not have that luxury. So not only are a lot of their guys playing a 40-minute game or very close to it, a lot of the women players get to sub in and sub out, something that Coach Granick's really made sure of. But on the men's side, they don't have that luxury, and other teams do. So it really puts them at the short end of the stick, and that's why I really think that you see that their road record's really taken a tumble.
Now, Zach, real quick here before we have to go to break, do you really think this will give the Pioneers some motivation to see that they've always kind of had that feeling the KIAC is not going to help them, they have to earn it themselves? Did this add a little bit more incentive to really go out there and win that tournament again this year on the women's side?
Usually the mantra for Coach Granick is, why not us? This year it's not why not us, it's we have something to prove. As if they've not had enough to prove already. They've been ranked in the NAIA top 25 on a couple of occasions. So to be honest with you, they have a lot to prove, but I really think that they're going to be motivated and they're going to be ready to go. They've got 3 games this week to prove themselves to end the losing streak. And really, they're angry, they're hungry, and assuming they win the quarterfinal on Tuesday, they'll have a chance to prove themselves at Alice Lloyd with the potential spot back to Sioux City, Iowa on the line.
Zach, it was great having you in studio. We look to having more of you and other Globe Riders in here on Sideline as well. We'll be right back after this break with the Courthouse Case of the Week.